Welcome to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little bit less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the artistic director at the Writer Center. More importantly for today, I'm an author. I primarily write fiction, but I feel like neutrinos are the stuff of maybe a little bit of science fiction still, because they're really hard to understand and they're deep in the cutting edge of physics. So I'm really excited to talk about them to the best of my ability and maybe talk a little bit more to the greater part of my ability about the craft of writing this book, which is really, really an amazing book. And I really want to welcome Alan and James here today for joining us. And everyone, please get a copy of the book if you're able. So Alan, James, I guess just if you could each in your own words, just sort of let me know who each of you are. Alan, why don't you kick that off for us?
Yeah, our collaboration is basically someone who's primarily a scientist and also a writer. That's me. And someone, I hope I'm not misrepresenting James when I say he's sort of the opposite. He's primarily a writer, but he knows a lot of science and does a lot of great science writing. So, I'm older than I want to be. So I've been in physics for quite a long time, a little over half a century. So, and most of that has been spent doing actual research in physics. And I met James when we both were working at the American Physical Society, which is not too far from where James is located right now. And we worked together there. And when the prospect of writing a neutrino book came up, and the publisher decided they did want a science/writer collaboration. That's how we got together and started writing the book. So pass it over to James.
Yeah, I've been a science journalist since, I can't even remember. That was my first role out of, I'm sorry, let me back up a little bit. I was an engineer with a particle accelerator experiment called the Superconducting Super Collider, which was in Texas near where Alan is right now. Then I went into science journalism after almost killing myself in a laboratory experiment. Decided it was safer to write about science than to do science. And I spent some time at the American Physical Society promoting science to writers, to journalists and to book writers. And I've recently come back to my first love, second after science, writing about science.
Well, if we have time at the end, I may bring back up that almost dying in an experiment, because I feel like there's an adventure story there. But that's not the focus for today, so I'm going to let it slide for the moment. So the first question we like to ask our guest writers is, some authors really find it great and liberating. Some of them hate it entirely. So I hope at least one of you finds this first question not to be horrible. But what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing practice? In other words, what haven't you gotten to speak about before? James, if you want to start on that one.
What haven't they asked me about the writing process? I think that not many people have asked about what it's like to work with a scientist. I think it's something that I often inject into a conversation, because most of the science journalists I work with don't ask that. And I think that it's not an uncommon thing. And it's an interesting and unusual experience. Most of my writing is solitary. My science journalism for Science Magazine and Scientific American, I don't collaborate as a rule. So this was a real change of venue for me to work with another author.
Alan, anything you'd like to add in terms of unexpected or unasked about parts of your writing?
I haven't written nearly as much as James, of course, but I've always found when writing about science that there's this, it's almost inherent in what you're doing. There's a tension between explaining something clearly and explaining it correctly. And science is filled with all kinds of caveats that, this is true, but maybe it's not really true, and we're still looking at this. And if you put all of that into what you're writing, you're being correct, but nobody's going to follow the ins and outs of everything you're doing. And if you leave it out, then I sort of felt like my role in this collaboration, or one of my roles, was to be on the side of making it correct as opposed to clear, and then James had to tidy it up afterwards, because somehow I felt that as someone who was identified as the scientist in the project, it was more my reputation that was on the line. If say a reviewer said, well, gee, they got that one all wrong, and this isn't that isn't what's happening at all, they would give James a pass, because he is a good scientist, but he's basically the writer. And they would say to me, how could someone who's been doing physics for all those years not realize that blah, 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 blah. So I had to, none of this is things that people have asked me, because just as James said, I haven't had a lot of conversations about writing books or articles or things like that. But I would say that walking that fine line between clarity and correctness is one of the arts of science writing that you have to pay close attention to.
I'm going to interpret that as don't let James lead you astray. That's
There were some things that were grossly inaccurate in what I wrote, and thank goodness Ellen was involved.
You said that, not me, but
so one thing that's interesting, and that someone else actually brought up, maybe when I was talking to my brother last night, I don't remember, was the issue of writing a book about something that's very much still in progress. This isn't like, and all science is always in progress. I understand that, but this one feels like there's still, we might look back at this in the future and realize this was the very dawn still of the neutrino study age. There's so much more to learn. How do you write authoritatively about that? What's the goal in what you share, and what is being correct? What is being correct when there's still so much to learn?
What your question reminds me is that, when we submitted our manuscript, it was several months, I think close to a year before the manuscript came out as a book. So we were, in addition to all, the problem you mentioned was exacerbated by the fact that something could have happened in those 7 or 8 months between when we wrote the book and when it came out that would have, negated or contradicted something that we had written. So it was a matter of keeping our fingers crossed that that the progress in the field, which is continuing, as you point out, would not be so rapid or so revolutionary that something would upset, make our book immediately obsolete as soon as it came out. On the other hand, we were hoping for a supernova to go off just before the book came out, because there's a chapter on that in the book, that neutrinos are very important in the physics of supernovas, and indeed that's probably, if a supernova does go off, probably the first thing we'll see is a burst of neutrinos, and that would have been a great sales pitch for the book, but we couldn't arrange it. I don't know what happened. It didn't happen.
Counting on supernovas for marketing purposes is always a tough.
A little bit risky.
James, do you have anything else you wanted to add to that one?
Well, I will say that the sort of the progression in the book does start with some of the things that are very well-founded, the discovery of the neutrino and some of the well-known aspects. But one of the reasons that we wrote about it, and we mentioned in the book, is that, and you said that people that are tuning in may not know much about neutrinos. You don't know much about neutrinos, but really, in a way, nobody knows much about neutrinos because there's so much that isn't known. And certainly there's a lot to speculate about, and a lot of possibilities that could fall on one side or the other. We point to those in the book, and the fact that we're sort of on the cusp of really interesting things happening is why we were excited, or at least I was excited about writing the book. I'm hopeful and expect this thing to be pretty much out of date within the next decade or so. And maybe if I'm still around, we'll write the sequel. But at least you can. There's enough in there that that would help people to understand it as these things develop.
Yeah, the sequel, or like the revised edition. I like this would be a great revised edition book. So we touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to dive a little bit more into collaboration, because I'm an author, but I've never done anything. I mean, I've probably written on some level with someone else, but I've never done anything nearly this large of a project collaborating with someone else. I think that's a really interesting thing to consider from the writing standpoint. How does your collaborative process work? I mean, who does what at what stages? Were there discussions beforehand, discussions during? How did this collaborate? Just broadly, how did the collaboration occur?
Not nearly as organized as your question would suggest, I have a feeling. In fact, some of it, James and I would independently and almost unbeknownst to the other person be writing the same section. I say, well, we have to have a section on this, so I'll write it. And meanwhile, James had already written a section on that also. And I think there even still to this, in the final version, there are places where we repeat things, maybe not exactly word for word, certainly, but we go over certain things more than once. And that's kind of a residue of the fact that we each wrote something that somehow worked its way into the book. So we talked frequently. We were working in different locations. We talked frequently, but we each wrote things independently. And I think actually James did more of the putting it together and making it all into a single, hopefully unified whole than I did.
Yeah.
I think there really has to be one author who does that, who is the one who takes all the material and puts it in proper form.
And we did use collaborative tools. We used mostly the Google Docs, so we could actually see each other making edits. I do know that when we wrote the first manuscript and gave it to my wife, who was an amazingly important person on this process, she's a science journalist as well, and she did a lot of editing, and she pointed out that it looked as though, at least in one iteration, as though we had not spoken to each other at all. And they were writing two separate books. And so a large part of that was blending it together. And although there are some topics repeated, in most cases, I would say, I believe at this point, they're all intentional in that intentional now, in the sense that they go over I think the most challenging parts. So doing that challenging part more than once, you could have looked at it so we could make it more efficient by throwing out one or the other. But Alan tended to have a different approach on things, a different view of things, but both of those views made them a little clearer. So in a way, in the long run, I think working independently and then coming together made some things much better. It made some things really hard to do. Getting that blend, getting that mix together was very, very difficult. But in the end, it does give perspectives that give you a better picture, I think, of some of the more challenging topics.
So you mentioned the Google Doc. I mean, was this a thing where, let's say, Alan, you added a piece and then James, you come back over it, and vice versa? James, you might add a piece, and then was there sort of like a live revision process going on, pointing out areas that needed clarity or correction? Was that just sort of was that part collaborative back and forth throughout the writing process?
Yeah, that absolutely was. I mean, as a matter of fact, once we got to a document that we had to share with the publisher, that slowed it down radically, because then we had to hand it back and forth. I don't know how people collaborated back in the old days, sending manuscripts back and forth. I can't imagine how difficult that must have been at the time, because this was difficult, and yet I could see him typing in the document, and it was like sitting next to him for some of the work.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is not true there. I mean, when you said how they collaborated in the past, I assume that if we had to deal with that kind of situation, a lot more of it would have been assigning different chapters to one or the other of us, and then we would, I'd write this chapter and he'd write that chapter, but that's not the way the book evolved. It was, I mean, there are some parts where James wrote a lot more than I did, for example, and it's not equal everywhere. But I wouldn't say that we never said, okay, this is all yours and this is all mine, or anything like that.
Was there anything particularly rewarding about this collaborative process? Was there anything particularly challenging about this process? And I mean challenging in the friendly challenge way.
We're both being remarkably silent when you ask.
Well, I will say that certainly one of the challenges is Alan tends to write in an academic style, and I write in a much more popular style. And to find a voice that we're both comfortable with, I would say it's like any sort of negotiation. It's sort of a reasonable amount of discomfort with what you end up with in the end. There are still things where I would like to pull it much more into the popular vernacular. And Alan, I'm sure it would be more comfortable going the other way with some things. But I think we reached a reasonably satisfactory medium.
Yeah, and one way we did a little bit of that was there are a couple of appendices in the book, and I don't know if anybody gets that far to read them, but some of the more, I think what James would call academic material that we couldn't fit into the main text ended up in the appendices. But I still recommend that people read those appendices because they're not on the main topic of the book, but I think they're interesting in and of themselves.
I always read the appendices, and yes, they are interesting. So I will vouch for the appendices of the book. I had one question come in from the chat, so I'm going to go there real quick. And the question is, what was the biggest misconception you addressed in the book? And I might expand that, like maybe what were some of the misconceptions that you felt like you had to address in the book when it came to neutrinos or physics more broadly?
James?
Well, I think one that, and it might be a little tricky to explain, and it's talking about the neutrinos changing identity from particle to antiparticle, which basically proves that they're their own antiparticle. And I've seen throughout my life, I've seen it described in a way that I never quite understood. It was analogous to some other flipping in physics, and it never felt right to me. And I think that we finally came up with, in our book, I think the first time where it's been explained that is consistent with the actual science. I'm not going to get into the details. It's probably better to read the book, but I was really excited to at least come to terms with this bit of science, which had always confused me for decades. And I think us working it out had clarified that to me. And I hope clarified it to our readers in a way that I'd like to see other people stop describing the physics of that phenomenon the way they have over the years.
Yeah, I don't know if this qualifies as misconception, but I think also we have the history that we go into at the early part of the book. Certainly a lot of physicists who work on neutrinos have only a very sketchy idea of what the early days of neutrinos were like and what it took to predict them, to detect them, and so forth. And actually another misconception, maybe it's not a misconception, but it's something that I felt we wanted to emphasize, is how incredibly difficult these experiments are. I mean, when you read a short article about, they're looking for neutrinos and they're doing this and that, you may not get the full flavor of how hard it is. Neutrinos are very, as we say in the subtitle, I mean, they're mysterious and elusive, and they're very hard to detect. And to actually do experiments with neutrinos is heroic. And so I hope we conveyed some of that in the book too.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm always baffled by how subtle some of these experiments are, and how what a little thing you're looking for with such a massive undertaking is absolutely baffling. I think represented really, really great in the book. So, and I will say too that I just made a note to myself while you're talking, like this. I joke about not understanding. I do read popular science very regularly, and this was the first book where my brain finally wrapped itself around spin. So I'm giving you credit for the quantum physics chapter got me like, oh, I sort of, I'm not saying I really understand it, but it doesn't like, it just glanced off me for like a dozen other books and finally like, oh, something clicked in this one. So yeah, you're definitely hitting some really good explanations. And it was just that one hit in the right way for me to finally at least have an inkling of what's going on with spin. It's no longer a complete opaque mystery for me. And on that, I think one of the things that great science writing does, especially for popular consumption, is it uses metaphor, because so many of these things that we're talking about are so abstract. They're something so tiny or so vast that a human brain can't handle it. And really the only way to move like someone who isn't dealing maybe with the numbers and the math behind it is through a good metaphor. And I think this book does it really skillfully in a lot of places, and really helped me understand some complex subjects. And I'm assuming going to be similar for other readers as well. So in general, and I'd be interested in hearing from both of you, one coming from the more academic side and one from the more popular consumption side, when and how do you decide to deploy metaphor? When do you decide to give us an example that's outside of the direct science itself?
I think one of the hallmarks of a really good science writer is the ability. You might use the word metaphor, or some maybe analogy is another word that comes to mind. You find something in everyday experience that is analogous to what you're trying to talk about, and you take that as far as it'll go. And I think most of the ones in the book are due. I mean, I think James was the one who can certainly talking about flavors of neutrinos as canapes in a party, and changing mysteriously as you carry them around the room. That would not have occurred to me, but that was something that I mean, I think it's an example of when James was saying he wanted to take something that we had to explain and put it in the kind of language that at least will give somebody an idea of what's going on. So I pretty much yield to James on that side of it, because he's I think a good science writer has to be able to do that, and he did most of that in the book that we just wrote.
Well, that's when you say when do you go with metaphor? My instinct is every time, just because that's really part and parcel to a job as a science journalist. And I think that in part, if I can't come up with a good metaphor, I realize I don't understand it well enough, and I have to go have a conversation with Alan. And there were, I think particularly when it came to, I think Alan talked about the horns of Jericho and various other analogies that brought it home to me. But I also think that in hashing this out and talking to him about the science and then narrowing it down to an analogy that he was comfortable with was sort of my indication. Okay, now I understand it, because as long as he didn't like my analogy, then I knew that I really didn't understand the science.
That's really interesting that it's also a tool for yourself as a writer to make sure you've reached the point of understanding the process enough to give it the analogy or the metaphor. So what makes one of these, I guess, James, what do you think makes one of these metaphors effective? It has to make sense to you, but I mean, obviously you have to have some consideration of audience. What are you looking for in like conveying to an audience? What makes it concrete and real for you?
Yeah, well, and that's one of the challenges of being a science journalist. Sometimes I'll ask a scientist, can you give me an analogy? And they'll give me an analogy that's to another scientific topic. So you need an analogy to understand their analogy. And I think that if it's not an analogy that appeals to somebody standing on the corner, we talked about handedness and somebody driving down the street and holding up their right hand and holding up their left hand. And I think that that's one of the analogies that a lot of scientists have told me that they think we did a really good job with that, because trying to explain handedness and chirality, I've seen scientists and engineers misunderstand those because of some of the poor analogies of the past. So if it's not an analogy that you can just if you didn't know anything about science and I explained to you what was going on with the analogy, it needs to be instantly recognizable to just my daughters who are in middle school, sort of a thing. And that's not that we're speaking down to people. It's just that the lack of information doesn't mean you're unintelligent, but the lack of information means that I have to find what's familiar to a very broad base, which is challenging. But I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy about it, is finding those analogies, finding those metaphors.
Alan, earlier you mentioned that concerned about like a reviewer seeing this and pointing out something that maybe was wrong. So I'm interested in how you were considering audience, because obviously we talked a little bit just then about a lay audience, so to speak, the non-scientific audience, the general readership. I mean, what do you consider the audience of this book to be? Is this a book you want solely for an audience of science enthusiasts who aren't scientists, or is this a book too that you want to have some value? You want to end up in a bookshelf of maybe a physicist of some sort as well?
Well, I mean, let me say first that as we were writing it, probably, I can't speak for James, but probably I was not being as conscious of the audience as I probably should have been. In other words, am I being too scientific, if you want to put it that way, and not popular enough, or vice versa? I mean, what lane do I write in when I'm doing that? And I actually was, even as I was doing that, I was thinking, well, it's good that James is going to get his hands on this, because I'm going to be writing it. So I'm probably going to say things that are unintelligible to our intended audience. And he will catch that, or maybe Martha will catch that, or something, and make it better than what I actually wrote originally. But I think when you mentioned physicists, I think the part that'll appeal most to physicists or one part that will appeal to physicists, is the history part at the beginning. Because as I mentioned before, I think physicists who may know, the science, they know the math, they know the science, they know more of what we're saying than we're putting in the book, but they don't really know the history we, as you probably know, we had a big advantage there because James had materials that were not available to any other person who was writing about the history of the neutrinos. So we have, there's it, in addition to the general story, there's the particular story of the Cowan and Reines experiment that James had an inside track on. And so I think that makes it very interesting too. So that, I think that's the part that would appeal to the physics people, whereas hopefully the more general audience also wants to learn about the physics of the neutrinos, which is a good part of the rest of the book.
Yeah. You mentioned history, and one thing I've noticed in a lot of popular science books, I just glanced over here, not even meaning to, and Richard Rhodes Making an Atomic Bomb is sitting right there. So a book that's about the science, but that's more of a journalistic historical account. But a lot of the books do take sort of a chronological historical approach. And I assume that's partly because it parallels the growth of our understanding of the subject. But history is such an important part of telling these stories. And we think of the science part, but they also almost always have some historical part too. And it's a really interesting combination for me as a writer. So why, I may have said it, but can you elaborate on why the chronological approach is so useful for a science narrative? And why is the story of physics so often also the story of the scientists, the physicists themselves? And James, maybe you can start on that one.
Yeah, well, there's certainly, of course, with science, things are cumulative, right? They do build upon the previous discoveries. You don't usually have a huge digression as time goes by. When we sat down and started working on the book, I actually didn't intend for it to necessarily be chronological. I think coming from a science writing background, it's important that the beginning be interesting, whether or not it happened at the beginning. In this case, we did have some inside information about some of the early things that nobody knew about. So that was another important aspect of the book, was to make sure that it was fresh and interesting and new for everybody, whether they were the general public who'd never heard the story at all, or a seasoned physicist who's been working on this their whole lives. So I think that's why it was a combination of both having the beginning at the beginning and having new information at the beginning that made us organize it in this particular way. I think probably the first couple drafts, the history didn't come in until later. But then in putting together the information and looking at the kind of cool, crazy stuff that had happened at the beginning, it put it towards the beginning. My aspiration is not necessarily to tell any given story chronologically. It just worked that way for this one, I think.
That's really interesting too, because mentioning something that's very important for all writing, which is sort of the hook or being interesting at the beginning. So it's interesting that this writing so focuses on the subject matter, but you still need to make someone interested in the subject matter enough to want to keep reading. So it's interesting to hear that like the same concerns are popping up in this this genre well outside my usual writing experience. But I guess I'm relieved to see that we're all sort of writing the same way with some of the same considerations, at least.
Yeah. Well, and certainly as we're going along, I tried to make sure that every chapter, to the extent that was possible, was a sort of complete drama that you could read I'd like to think you could read that chapter and say, well, here's some tension at the beginning, here's some rising action, here's something that wraps it up at the end and maybe calls back to the beginning, instead of just a linear telling of the story.
Great. So on the subject of history, but also on the subject of the physics and the science and the math, and people and places, that there's obviously you had some pre-existing knowledge on the subject, but I'm sure probably both of you at different points had to do some research to flesh out what was going on. So I'm interested in broadly how you research this book, both technically and historically. And I guess, Alan, if you want to start this one, how did research come into your process?
Well, I some sections I knew pretty well, and but others, there's a. I was going back to the original physics literature in a lot of cases to find, if I wanted to make sure that we were telling the story accurately about the status of a certain experiment or some wrinkle in the physics. One of the complicated things there's this whole subject of neutrino oscillations, of the flavors of neutrinos changing as the neutrinos propagate. And it gets even more complicated because neutrinos that are created inside the sun have to interact with all the electrons in the sun before they get out. And it makes things very, and so the first step is to make sure that we're getting that. That's a complicated story, and you've got to go back to the papers and maybe some of the textbooks that talk about that stuff, and make sure we know what you're saying. And then you have to repurpose it and repackage it in a way that, you're obviously not going to just copy out of a technical paper or something like that. It has to be couched in very different terms, but you want to say it correctly. So I was actually reading quite a bit of the original literature as we were doing that stuff, so I don't know how else to answer your question, but it's definitely, there was definitely a process of that kind of research. It was almost similar to the kind of research I would do if I was trying to write a physics paper, but get the background of the field that you're interested in before you actually tackle a certain problem. Here, the problem was writing it up in a sensible way and explaining it without distorting it too badly.
I love the idea that you went back to a subject you already know well to get just rebuild that foundation so that foundation is super strong before you begin writing. James, I might have cut you off there.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say that. So Alan obviously was more equipped to handle that sort of literature. I spent a lot of time speaking to people who some of them were around during the formative years, and looking at there's new information that's coming out because a lot of this was classified at the time. There's stuff being declassified continuously. So I spent a lot of time in the CIA FOIA reading room, and going back to personal recollections of these various scientists. We had aspects to some of their personal notes. So to me, it was much more about the people and then looking and talking to them to find out where it should go from there. So one of, there's a part of the story about Ettore Majorana, a very tragic tale. I don't know if you recall that part where he dies probably by suicide. A lot of that has been covered in sort of dense biographies, but there is a great deal that hasn't been covered. And there are people, you would talk to people and they will tell you aspects of the story. So to me, it was more like traditional journalism on my part, where I would call people up and we'd have long conversations and wide-ranging conversations, and something interesting would pop up, and we would delve into that, and would give me some other opportunity to do some more background research or talk to other experts about the story.
So I feel like we talked a little bit about like the pre-research, the research to begin the project. How did research play a role maybe ongoing? I mean, how often do you find yourself having to go during the writing process or during the revision process? How often did you have to like, oh, we're missing something, I need to go find it, or I need to go clarify something at that point? Was most of the research at the beginning, or was there ongoing research of a pretty substantial nature too?
I think it was continuous. I mean, I think Alan and I would have these conversations where we'd say, "Oh no, we've forgotten a topic," or "Here's this person that's still alive that was there. We should give them a call." Alan, did you have that sort of feeling as well?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was more as we were writing along, we would be doing the research at the same time, or as Brent was saying, finding new people to talk to, or new avenues to explore. So it was an organic process. It was not somehow that we said, okay, first we do the research, now the research is done, and let's sit down and do the writing. I mean, I know there are projects that go that way, but that's not the way we were doing this one.
Great, thank you. So just a real quick reminder to anyone who wants to ask a question in the chat window, please give us some questions from you. I'd love to fit a few more in before the end of our chat. But for now, back to my questions. I was a little interested in your influences as writers, and what sorts of writing influence the way you write. Alan, I'm assuming there's obviously lots of science reading in your background, but is there any other sort of reading material you go to? And I guess the question is really, where does your style come from? Because I mean, even though I don't see in this book clear delineations between who is necessarily writing when. So I do feel like you maybe undersold yourself on your writing style a little bit, Alan and James. Both of you can comment on this for sure. But like, what are your influences in terms of being writers? Who are the other authors or other writers that you maybe turn to as people you want to emulate, or maybe recognize as the people behind your writing?
Well, I'm going to let you start with that, because I have to think about that.
Well, I will say, I mean, I think that I have always wanted to, and I think we have spectacularly failed in this. I've always wanted to write a book that is vaguely as good as Davis Sobel's Longitude. If anybody here hasn't read Longitude, it is such a beautiful book. And so, I don't think I will ever achieve anything where I feel like it's as nice as her book or some of her other books that she's done. But certainly Richard Rhodes, and I'm trying to think. It'll take me a minute to come up with other names, but there are these. There's the Silent Spring, I can't remember the author of Silent Spring, and
Rachel Carson,
and then of course lately the author who wrote Bonk and Stiff, Mary Roach. Who
I have a helper on the couch back here who's whispering them to me when.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. But we never achieved the level of humor that Mary Roach does, or the level of poetry that Davis Sobel does. But I think that whenever I was writing a chapter and felt like it was getting a little too maybe teachy, a little too pedantic, I would tend to, I just naturally anyway, but it reads something inspirational and then try to have a little bit of Davis Sobel, a little bit of Mary Roach, a little bit of Richard Rhodes. And, I don't think anyone would ever accuse us of succeeding in any of those things, but it certainly gives you some inspiration, or gave me some inspiration.
Yeah, I think I'm going to punt on that question. I can't
perfect.
really think. I mean, there are a lot of influences, but nothing that I sort of would zone in on and say, okay, this is how I want to write something.
Sure. Do you either, just real quickly, do you read outside of the genre? I mean, are your readers in general of different genres, of the fictions and other nonfictions and things like that, or are you primarily focused on the science side of writing?
Well, I like a lot of the history side of physics or other sciences, and I think that goes way back. I mean, when I was very young, one of the first books I remember reading in that genre was something called Microbe Hunters by somebody named Paul de Kuif, and it was all about Pasteur and Koch and other pioneers of medicine in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and what they did, and some of them quite heroic because they tried these things out on themselves before they in any case, it was just kind of so I've continued to like reading books about other biographies of scientists, and not so much popular science books like the one we tried to write, because most of those are not aimed at practicing scientists, but books about the history of I get sort of find it inspiring to read about scientists and what they did. I mean, you can, when James says he can read something like Longitude and get inspired to say, I want to write a book like that. Well, I can read about the life of some famous scientist and say, gee, it would be nice to be able to do science like that too. So I could recommend a few books like that, but those are the kind of books I enjoy reading.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't read history books or science books for pleasure so much. I mean, I read them. I read the good ones, but I would say that most of my reading is probably fiction. I'd have to think my favorite book is probably Catch-22, and we have, my wife Martha and I, we have literally thousands of books downstairs and one bookshelf that's dedicated to popular science books, and most of those are written by people that I've known over the years, Sean Carroll and things like that. I mean, Davis Sobel's book really does stand out. But the other thing that I've gotten into recently is reading memoirs by scientists from the 1900s, or the 19th century, from the 1800s, which are stunningly dramatic. You don't see memoirs like that anymore. There's one about a mathematician named Maupertuis, I guess even earlier, who went to the Arctic to measure the shape of the Earth, and it reads like the Swiss Family Robinson. And yet he's this mathematician scientist who did this thing. And, I don't think I've seen anything like that in recent decades.
Well, even in physics, I mean, even the scholarly literature, if you go back, reads a lot differently than it does now. I mean, it has a lot more personality to it. And when somebody's doing an experiment, they're really telling you how they actually did the experiment, and not just some thing that says methodology and results and blah blah blah. I mean, so things have changed over the years.
Great. So we had a couple questions come into the chat window, so I want to go over there for a second. What was the genesis of writing a book on neutrinos? Were you approached by a publisher about this topic, or was it pitched by you instead? And then part two, that is any advice for others interested in writing a science book?
Yeah, actually, that's the question. I'm glad that came up. I had meant to even bring that up independently. So getting a book contract is hard, as most people know, and certainly approaching publishers cold is very, very hard. The number of rejections I've gotten that way are just uncountable. But both this book and a previous book, which I was asked to write and I ended up not writing after all, came about because I had written popular science news articles. This when I was living in Los Alamos, which is where the neutrino was detected, and I wrote a story about neutrinos for Scientific American. The publisher from MIT Press saw it and said, "We need this. Somebody needs to write this book." And I said, "Well, I'm available." And then probably the first or second article that I wrote as a science journalist was about nuclear fusion. And a publisher saw it and contacted me and asked if I would like to write a book about fusion. And I tried, but I was young and poor, and writing books is not a good way to get out of being young and poor. You stay young, but you stay poor too. So I didn't end up doing that book. But in both cases, I had been approached because of news articles that I had written. And you don't have to be a seasoned journalist to get articles like this. And so now when I think about writing books in the future, my plan is to try to find a way to write an engaging feature, pitch it around until it's still hard to get a freelance story picked up. You can get a lot of rejections, but it's a lot easier than getting the book. And then once you get the feature, that's something that you could potentially send to journalists to book publishers, or if you're fortunate, you'll have one knock on your door.
I think even Longitude started out that way, if I remember correctly.
It did, in fact.
She
Yeah, she wrote it for the New
and
Yorker.
And they said, "Hey, this could be a book," and she wrote that book.
Right. Well, and as a matter of fact, there's a book by a friend of ours named Don Lincoln that came out contemporaneously with ours called Einstein's Unfinished Dreams. If you Google that, two things come up: his book that's on Amazon right now, and the article that he wrote about 3 years ago with exactly the same title. So I'm sure that's the same story there.
By the way, that as a tip, I've noticed that people often, it helps to put the word Einstein in the title of your book if you're writing a science book. Even crazy things like "Who Got Einstein's Office?" and there's a book with that title, and Einstein's refrigerator, and what Einstein told his postman. People just work Einstein into the title of the book, and it seems to, for obvious reasons, has the selling point.
I'll give away this title for free, which is "What Einstein Never Dreamed," is the book that's going to sell 1 billion copies.
Yeah, exactly, because it has if you said it right, if it's what Niels Bohr never dreamed, it wouldn't sell nearly as much.
We didn't call this Einstein's ghost particle, though. What were you thinking?
Yeah.
Any other advice for people interested in writing science books? I think you had a couple really great pieces of advice there, but anything else you'd say for an aspiring science book writer?
I think so. I've heard two pieces of advice when it comes to writing a science book, and one is don't write the book before you talk to the publisher, because they might want to see something else. But then I've seen other people say, write the book you want to write, and then talk to a publisher and see if you can adapt it. We have spoken to publishers at science conferences. They show up on the show floor where they have like the advertisers and people selling scientific equipment. They also have these book publishers there selling their books or giving their books away in some cases. In any case, the people standing there are the assigning editors very often. So it's a great way to meet and pitch your story, either your complete book or your idea, and find out whether it's even worth working on. I don't know where else to find them. Maybe there are other conferences to find them, but I don't think they're expecting. I don't think they're expecting to be overwhelmed by people with ideas, and so you have a little more of their time, a little more of their attention in those circumstances.
Great. Thank you. Next question from the chat is good because I think it's getting a little bit more about the subject, which I would really like to hit on here before we wrap up for the night. So how did studying and thinking deeply about neutrinos affect the way that you understand the universe? I'd really like to hear that from both your perspectives too.
I mean, I actually, the part of the book that taught me the most about, well, in order to write about neutrinos, we not only write about neutrinos, but we wrote about neutrinos and cosmology. Because there is an impact of neutrinos on the cosmos. And part of that is supernovas, but there's also dark matter and probing very deeply into the early universe using neutrinos, which is something people are trying to do, although it's a very hard thing to do. But those kind of things, first of all, I started out knowing very little about that, and it really did open my eyes a little bit about things that go beyond just what are neutrinos, but how can you use neutrinos to understand other parts of physics, and so that's in the book, and I found it very interesting.
Yeah, I think a similar sort of take for me, and that is, I hadn't thought very deeply about the relic neutrinos, which we mentioned in the book. Everyone sitting here is full of about 15 million or so of these neutrinos that are the oldest particles left in the universe. They're from the very beginning. And so the fact that we're sitting here essentially in touch with the very beginning of the universe, to me, is just sort of mind-blowing. We can't see them yet. We can't interact with them yet. We can't learn much about them yet, but I think we will. Alan might be able to weigh in more than I would. But even if we didn't, the fact that we're full of these little teeny relics from the very beginning of time is still, to me, just completely mind-blowing.
I love anytime the scale of these things is thrown at me, because we're going from the cosmology side to as big as we can imagine to the tiniest particles we can imagine to time frames, which are impossibly small, to pushing the infinite. It's so anyway, just anytime I'm pushed with those like absolutes in any directions, like my brain hurts a little bit, but also like discovering significance when you're just that little speck in all these other different scales and times and spaces is always fascinating for me, and I always have. We should say humble as writers. It's a good way to be humble, to think about that.
Good point.
So we're getting a little close to the end. Let me just glance at my sheets here and see what I wanted to hit. We covered publication. What's next for each of you? What's the next thing, either as in terms of writing? Are there more books in the future, more articles, more research? What's coming next?
Well, we have a collaboration. We're hoping. We haven't heard for sure. Where there's some positive rumblings that our publisher to write a book about. Alan is more the expert on this, but 100 years ago, I guess it'll be. Yeah, we're coming up on the 100th anniversary, right, Alan?
Yeah,
two of the most important years in quantum mechanics.
Yeah, the birth of quantum mechanics took place in 1925, 26. And it really is kind of of all the scientific revolutions you could imagine, it probably the most revolutionary. And so we would like to write both about what happened then and also the impact of that as going forward, and the questions that there's still a lot of questions about quantum mechanics that are not that are still controversial, shall we say, today. So there's a lot to discuss, and so we wanted to. I thought it would be an interest. I mean, it was also take advantage of the centennial to write something like that, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do that.
Well, and the characters that are involved, Schrodinger and Heisenberg and other people that were around at the time are really fascinating. Some for mildly despicable reasons.
Yeah, it is interesting because both Heisenberg and Schrodinger, James used the word despicable, but I'll stay with that word. I mean, they, in very different ways, they did things that you could describe as not when they were inventing quantum mechanics, but in other aspects of their lives, things that we might not totally approve of these days. So that's interesting to write about too.
you've absolutely sold me on this book. So if the publisher balks at all, let me know and I'll help you find another publisher because
Thank you, Zach.
this
Thank
needs
you.
to exist.
Yeah.
This needs to exist. So we're right at the end. So going to our last question, and this is a question we'd like to ask all our guests, which is, what's one piece of advice you'd offer to a writer just starting out on a nonfiction book or maybe a nonfiction project, similar, an article project similar to what you've been working on?
My advice to anyone in my position would be to find a really good science writer to collaborate with.
Well, and I agree. I mean, on the other side, it's nice to. Few things scare me more than getting something in print that's absolutely wrong, and so it's nice to have a scientist I could blame to bring along with me. But I think that, you know, this is, anytime you do this, it's something that you're going to be living with for quite a while. So I don't want to say that you have to love your topic, but you better be relatively fond of it if you're going to dedicate this sort of time. It took much longer than I anticipated, and I think we're prepared for the next time around. But I was sick of neutrinos for a little while, and I was a big neutrino fan before this started. I've come back around, but I'd had enough right about in the middle.
Maybe that's the practical advice, which is you may wear yourself out in a subject, but no, you'll get over it. You'll recover eventually. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming out this evening and everyone who's watching later on the recording. If you haven't read it already, please pick up a copy of Ghost Particle. You can get it from your local independent bookseller, or we put in the link for bookshop.org, which is a website that helps local independent booksellers. If you can't afford to buy it, ask your local library. They will get a copy and let you check it out. And then it exists in your local library for other people to discover as well. So any way you can support our authors is really, really great. And we encourage you to do so. So Alan, James, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Thank you for writing with us a little bit more about the science, and for your scientific insights as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. This was
Thanks. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Well, have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you next time.